After an initial second of shock, scantily clad women being just about the last thing we'd expected to find in an inquisitorial research facility, we realized that things were not as they seemed. It's hard to say what tipped us off exactly. It might have been the odd shape of her ears, or the unnatural harmonics of her singing. Or maybe it was the words Eldar Subject Number 4 printed on the back of her tattered straitjacket. Regardless, our well-honed inquisitorial investigation abilities told us that while the creature prying at the containment unit was female, she was not a woman. She was also not an orc, no matter what Twitch said. So no shit, there we were, standing in the only entrance of a room containing a half-naked, unarmed Eldar of the female persuasion, who was apparently too focused on singing to the Demonthrope containment unit to even notice our arrival. The question of what to do in this sort of situation is something that bored guardsmen or idle cogitator adepts might spend endless amounts of time arguing over. Not us, though. We were above that sort of thing. Yeah, okay, no, we weren't. I mean, aside from avoiding work and blowing things up, pointless arguments, especially sordid ones, were just about our favorite pastime. It was just that before we could get started, Tink noticed that a tendril of Wraithbone was snaking out towards the singing Eldar from the containment unit. Before any of us could stop him, the techie stepped around the corner, raised his plasma gun, and told the Xenos to stop messing with his stuff and get her own damned Wraithbone. Nubby snickered, Doc groaned in exasperation, and Twitch pulled Tink out of the way of the bolt of lightning the Eldar flung at him. We all reflexively ducked into cover as 2 more lightning bolts shot through the hole. And when we peeked around the corner again, the entire back half of the small room was filled with an opaque mist. The next minute or so were spent calling Tink names. This was not the most productive use of our time, but none of us were dumb enough to try running into the mist and dislodging the Xenos Psyker. Doc was especially miffed, since his whole job had been to stop the rest of us from doing something like this, and Tink kept using that as an excuse for why this wasn't his fault. Anyway, after another minute or so of juvenile arguing, it became apparent that the Eldar's mist wasn't going to just dissipate on its own, and something proactive needed to be done. Unfortunately, our options were sort of limited. Tink proposed a flash and clear, but the rest of us had bad memories of the last time we'd tried that on a prepared psyker, and made it Plan B. Nubby spoke up next and suggested going to get Fumbles, who was still making noise somewhere at the back of the evidence warehouse. Since this would involve either splitting up or leaving the Eldar to mess with the containment unit, and because we weren't too optimistic about Fumbles' ability to go head-to-head with an Eldar Psyker, this was made Plan C. Twitch began to suggest something truly harebrained, but was cut off by Doc, who'd decided that he'd had enough and it was time to take charge of the situation. In an odd repeat of the last time we'd faced this sort of thing, Doc poked his head around the corner and attempted to engage the Xenos in diplomacy. To our immense surprise, instead of shooting our medic in the head with a lightning bolt, the Eldar stopped singing to listen to him. Now, Doc wasn't a good smooth talker, but he did tend to radiate a sort of awkward earnestness, which can really count for something in this sort of situation. The rest of us watched all this with varying degrees of incredulousness as he started off with an apology for Tink's behavior, and then began explaining the overall situation and how the containment unit figured into it. The Eldar only responded with more silence, but since that wasn't a lightning bolt, Doc took it as a good sign and moved a little farther into the room as he continued talking. It was honestly the most impressive attempt at interspecies diplomacy we'd ever witnessed. I mean, sure, We'd seen whole worlds shared between humans and Tau, but the Slitheads tend to be sort of wishy-washy, and there'd probably been a lot of highly trained diplomats involved in that. This was just one slightly naive soldier trying to convince a Xenos, who probably had a massive grudge against the Inquisition, not to mention a racial affinity for dickishness, to give peace a chance. It was powerful, moving really, and we all honestly believed that given enough time, it totally would have worked. The thing was, though, that while Doc was making his heartfelt plea, Tink was playing around with his drone controller and managed to get control of Spot's recon sensors, as well as one of the mundane psi suppressors. And we were sort of on a tight schedule, what with the Demonthrope doing Emperor knew what above us, and Fumbles still needing a rescue. And, better safe than sorry, right? The Eldar had a second to be very surprised when her cloud of mist fizzled into nothing, and then a barrage of plasma and pulse rounds knocked her off the containment unit. Doc was not happy, even though we pointed out that our shots had missed anything immediately fatal, so if he really wanted to, he could patch the Xenos up and give her the whole friendship speech again. With that last obstacle out of his way, Tink ran over to the containment unit to see what the Eldar had done to it, and to figure out if the fancy Wraithbone suppressor was salvageable. While he got to work, Doc grumpily dragged the bleeding Xenos into a position where he could simultaneously treat her and keep an eye on the entrance. Nubby and Twitch loitered for a few seconds to see if they were needed for anything, until an especially loud shout for help from Fumbles reminded them that they had something better to do. Nubby and Twitch's trip around the edge of the big room was relatively uneventful. It seemed like everything that was capable of movement had either fled the room or run off to join the big melee, which was now reaching some sort of climax. The two troopers ignored the massive clusterfuck, pausing to let the occasional running gunfight go past or dodge a falling stack of boxes. The only real excitement was when a cargo servitor holding an obese man crashed across their path, and then began bashing its captive against one of the stacks like an unwanted cat. The fat man was probably a psyker, because as he screamed for help, reality went a bit non-Euclidean, and the floor started growing faces. But that might have had something more to do with the large box labeled extra heretical that he was being bashed against. Either way, the two troopers ignored the altercation and walked through the patch of warped reality with the ease of people who'd seen worse phenomena on trips to ship's mess. Aside from those little inconveniences, finding Fumbles wasn't really that hard. It was just a matter of heading in the general direction of all the psychic shouting, and then homing in on the sense of bowel-loosening fear emanating from the little psyker. So before long, Twitch and Nubby reached the corner of the room where Fumbles was hiding, and discovered what had him so worked up. They then, very carefully, stepped backwards into cover to observe the situation. The scene was a weird one. Fumbles, or some other scrawny little psyker that periodically flickered in and out of visibility and radiated fear, had been chased up a large pile of boxes by a mob of small green figures that looked vaguely like Nubby. The Gretchens were taking turns, climbing up the pile and then fleeing back down as Fumbles' aura of terror overwhelmed them. But that sort of behavior wasn't anything too unusual given their racial affinity for cowardice. It was their boss that was the weird part. You know those really secure prisoner transport thingies? Like with all the straps holding someone to a gurney, along with a face mask and maybe some padlocks? Dial that up to 11. Replace the gurney with a hand truck being pushed by 3 Gretchen, standing on each other's shoulders, and replace the prisoner with a raving orc weird boy surrounded by an aura of crackling green light. And when I say raving, I mean it. The weird boy could speak Gothic, seemed to be using his mouth to compensate for being unable to move for anything else, and from the sound of it was even by orc standards, completely batshit insane. It was hard to keep track of everything he was saying, but in the minute or so Twitch and Nubby were listening, the primary theme seemed to be that he wanted Fumble's head. Literally. You know, like attached to his shoulders with stitches and stuff. He even had a Gretchen with a surgical mask standing by. From what we could tell, his motivation for this had something to do with 2 heads being better than 1, and it being the secret to the brainy homie's power. So yeah, totally nuts. And very frustrated with Fumbles, who kept doing rude things like refusing to come down to be decapitated, or claiming that he was only a figment of the orc's imagination. Now, as amusing as it would have been to stand there and keep watching the orc arguing with Fumbles, it just wasn't in the cards. Shortly after Twitch and Nubby arrived, the weird boy ran out of patience and announced that Fumbles had till the count of, 4 to come down, or I'ma squig ya. Up to this point, Twitch had just been muttering to himself about how he'd known it all along, and Nubby had mostly been trying to figure out if the box he was hiding behind, marked probably not heretical, had anything tactically useful and or valuable inside of it. It didn't. But then this new time limit kicked them into gear. Both troopers raised their weapons and got ready to shoot the weird boy as soon as it finished its counting, and began drawing on its notoriously unstable powers. Over the next 20 seconds, the orc, with the help of his Gretchen horde, managed to count up to 2, then skipped to 5, got confused at 8, went back down to 6 for another try, and finally decided to skip ahead to 13. Nubby and Twitch lowered their weapons again. Since there was apparently enough time to do something more clever than just spraying and praying, Twitch brought out the mechanical action mine that was his last remaining explosive. For his part, Nubby began waving at Fumbles while concentrating on the thought of turning Twitch invisible, while he planted the mine on the still counting weird boy. Fumbles noticed the waving and caught on pretty quickly. The little psyker faded back into visibility, screwed up his face in concentration, and Twitch faded out. The demolition trooper moved fast, which is why he was only 5 meters from the weird boy when a violent burst of energy from the warp smashed into Fumble's mind, sending him reeling. Twitch swore as his invisibility fizzled, hucked the mine towards the weird boy like a frisbee, and sprinted back towards Nubby as the little trooper opened on full auto. Several things happened at once. Twitch's mine bounced off the thick metal band restraining the weird boy's head, sailed off in a random direction, was snatched out of the air by an overenthusiastic Gretchen, and promptly exploded. The force of the blast knocked the weird boy's dolly over, taking the orc out of Nubby's line of fire and crushing the 3 Gretchens that had been pushing it. Nubby adjusted his aim, but as he did so, the orc psyker bellowed something. Somewhere in the pack of Gretchens, one of them exploded in a shower of green sparks and a small cloud of acrid smoke. The rest surged forwards with a high-pitched wah, intercepting Nubby's fire and closing the gap surprisingly fast. Nubby held the trigger down until Twitch reached him, and they both did some quick math, decided that 30 and an enraged weird boy to 2 odds weren't in their favor, and cheesed it. Now, despite what it looked like, this was not a cowardly retreat. It was actually a carefully planned tactical maneuver to distract the enemy from the true objective. Or, at least, it turned out that way in any case. Veteran retreaters that they were, Twitch and Nubby easily outpaced the Xenos, and broke contact long enough to come up with a plan and split up. Twitch stayed on the path that they'd been following. He found a nice firing position and started shooting Gretchens as they came around a handy corner, racking up 7 kills without any real trouble. Then the weird boy, and the Gretchens pushing him, shot around the corner, tilting up on one wheel and bellowing, "It's squiggin' time!" as he came. There was a brief struggle of wills. at the end of which Twitch's mind was fairly certain that he was actually a hyper-carnivorous ball of teeth. Luckily, Twitch's body was harder to convince, and shook off the weird boy's attack with no more damage than a few lacerations and a pulled muscle or two. The demolitions trooper blinked, realized how close to a fate worse than death he'd just become, and decided it was time to get running again. The small orcish horde let out another "Wah!" and followed him. A few dozen meters away, Nubby sidled out through a gap between two stacks of boxes and found himself back where the chase had started. A quick scan of the area revealed that a few Gretchen had stayed behind and were in the process of carrying the still-stunned Fumbles down from his perch on the pile. Nubby, not being one to do hard work himself, when others seemed to be willing to do it for him, pulled out a low stick and casually waited for the Gretchen to finish before gunning them down. Then, his heroic rescue completed, the little trooper wandered over to Fumbles and checked the psyker's status by prodding him in the ribs a few times. When this elicited nothing more than a faint groan, Nubby, muttering to himself about how he always had to do everything, grabbed one of Fumbles' legs and began dragging the psyker back towards the Demonthrope crater. Meanwhile, Twitch was barely staying ahead of the weird boy, who'd started emitting some sort of brilliant, crackling energy that boosted the speed of it and its minions. It really was something out of the paranoid trooper's nightmares. Gretchen kept popping out of side alleys before he could turn into them, and every time he hit a straightaway, the weird boy's hand truck gained a little ground. The fear just lent Twitch even more speed, though, and anyway, he had a plan. Mind you, it lacked the large amount of explosives that would make it a good plan in his eyes, but it was still a plan. On the outskirts of the minor war occurring in the middle of the evidence warehouse, a group of Genestealer cultists finally finished off the inquisitorial minions that had been keeping them from the cell that contained their master. They clustered around the cell door and began hacking at it with their claws and weapons, but paused at the sound of approaching footsteps, and turned to face the new threat. Twitch came around the corner at a dead sprint, saw the group of mutated cultists sighted on an alley on the far side of their group, closed his eyes, and triggered the underbarrel flash grenade launcher on his pulse carbine. He barreled into the stunned cultists, knocking two aside with his shoulders and nearly tripping over a third, and somehow managed to push his way through them to the alley he had targeted, where he slammed headfirst into a crate. Twitch reeled backwards, barely dodging a falling crate marked Class 5 Forbidden Xenotech, and staggered into the alley before any of the cultists could follow. Behind him there was a high-pitched "Wah!" and the distinctive sound of a warp-propelled hand truck slamming through bodies like a demented war chariot. There was a split second where Twitch worried that he'd underestimated the weird boy's momentum and the Xenos would just bowl through the cultists and keep chasing. But then he heard a horrible slorp sound and a bellow of "Youse gets a squiggin', and youse gets a squiggin', and youse gets a squiggin', everyone gets a zoggin' squiggin'." With that, Twitch declared the plan a success and began working his way towards the Demonthrope crater. After a minute or so, he ran into Nubby, who complained that he was tired of dragging Fumbles and insisted Twitch take a turn. Fumbles groaned and asked whether he could be carried upright, as the floor was really beginning to chafe. The three of them arrived back at the crater just in time to see Doc get stabbed in the face.